H&R Trains is located on the west coast of Florida in the Tampa-St. Petersburg area in Pinellas Park, Florida. Just minutes from the Tampa Airport and downtown St. Petersburg. H&R Trains is more of a model railroad complex than just a store, with over 10,000 square feet of floor space dedicated entirely to trains and children of all ages. Our service personnel can be seen in our engine and car shops through the large window at the east end of the retail store. The shop is equipped with the latest state-of-the-art equipment to handle almost any type of installation or repair. We are the exclusive importer of stainless steel track for 1 gauge or G scale. This track is made for us by TDV of France. This is one of the most exciting new products for outdoor garden railroads in over 20 years. H&R Trains manufactures exclusive products under our brand name of Heritage Railroad Collection, Railroad Bears or Hobo Bears, and much more. The Village Express is a nostalgic all-metal train which is perfect size for your holiday village. It comes in a custom-crafted wooden box with room for extra cars and other equipment. The store has several operating layouts, including an outside garden railroad with over 360 feet of track. The outdoor railroad operates every Saturday, year-round, rain or shine. We encourage our customers to get hands-on experience with the Garden Railroad and even issue an engineer's card to any youngster who helps us run the railroad. Explore the many types of dioramas which you will be able to build after viewing this video. The Chester Holly Research Library and Learning Center has books and videotapes on both prototype and model railroad subjects. It includes magazines from 1939 to the present. The library is also equipped with a computer design station where you may design your own model railroad. The Learning Center is a place where classes are held on a wide range of model railroad subjects. It's also a place to just relax with a book from the library. H&R Trains is truly a model railroader's paradise.
Hello, I'm Don Morris from H&R Trains in Pinellas Park, Florida. For the next hour or so, I'm going to talk with you about how easy it is to do scenery. Whether you're doing scenery for a model railroad or for Miniatures Village or Christmas Village, it can be fun and it is easy. You should already have your trains running if you plan on using a train on your layout. And then the next element that we're going to do is ballasting of the track, and that's what we're going to start with here. The materials we're going to use for this project are all made by a company called Woodland Scenics. This company has made scenery materials for quite some time. They started out making it for the architectural model field, and it works quite well for model railroading. We're going to use a material called ballast, which are very small particles that look like rock. They come in various colors. We'll spread that along the track, and then we'll glue that in place with a material which is called scenic cement or matte formula. Now this looks like it might be Elmer's glue and water thinned out, but it really is not. If you were to use Elmer's glue and water, when it dries it would leave shiny little fillets around the rock. This material dries totally transparent and gives a very natural appearance to the rock. We're only going to use 2 tools for this process. The first one is a very inexpensive brush to brush the ballast between the ties and around the track and shape it. And the second is a very large eyedropper. Now, both of these can be obtained very cheaply at a Home Depot or a Scotty's or Builder Supply of some sort. The eyedropper that we're going to use is a very large eyedropper that can be purchased at a drugstore, and it would be used for administering something like Tylenol to a youngster. We're going to start by pouring ballast between the rails in such a way that we can spread it out with a brush. All right, we want to start by spreading the ballast out along the track. Brushing it down between the rails, between the ties, and out from between the ties so that it looks like the natural rock you might see on a railroad. Shaping as we go so that it looks just like you might see in real life. If you need to use your fingers to do this, you can do that as well. Finishing it off possibly with a brush. Now this isn't something you can rush. It takes time to get it to look just exactly like you want it, and it's important that you get the shape the way you want it before you apply the glue. Once you've completed getting the ballast in place with the brush, it's time to use the scenery cement to glue it in place. Now the scenery cement should be used full strength. It has a small amount of liquid detergent in it that helps it to work out into the material. I can't emphasize enough that this can't be rushed. You have to take your time and do it one drop at a time and let the material soak out into the ballast material. Now I'm going to put some of this into a cup to make it a little bit easier to get with the eyedropper, and then we're going to put one drop between each tie along the track and allow it to soak out before we go any further. Now that's all we're going to do, is just one drop. Now it'll take some time for that to soak out, but it will eventually. You'll see it running down into the ballast. Now if you were to rush this, what's going to happen, it would cause the ballast to wash out between the ties. We don't want that to happen. So you need to take your time and just let it run down at its own rate. Now you can see where we started earlier, the cement has already run down in between the ties and started soaking into the ballast. That's what I was talking about. It takes time to allow that to happen. Now it'll take probably a dozen or so passes to make sure that this goes down at the rate that you want it to infiltrate the ballast. Now that we've made several passes with the scenery cement, you notice how it's starting to fill in around the ties in between the rails. At this point we can put on a little bit more than we were putting on previously, but we still have to be careful that we don't get too much on where it washes the ballast out from between the ties. It'll take a number of passes. This isn't something you can rush. If you're using smaller track, it won't take quite as long, but track like this will take a number of passes to make it soak in properly. Now you can see where it's starting to run all the way out to the edge. We want to continue adding the scenery cement until it's totally soaked in on both sides of the track all the way out to the very edge of the ballast, being careful again not to add it so fast that it washes out from between the rails. Once the entire ballast area is wet, then we'll let this dry overnight before we proceed any further with it. Now that the ballast has had a chance to dry overnight, I want to show you what the ballast and the track should look like after it's completed. I've taken the liberty of detailing the track somewhat, and I'll show you what I've done. It's important that the track look realistic, and it really adds a lot to your layout if you take the time to do the extra detail. The first thing I did is I used a rail brown color with a brush, and I used the brush to brush just the inside of the rails on both sides because the track always looks rusty. The second thing I did is I used a grimy black in between the ties where there might be oil deposits and other dirt and debris from the train itself. And then any other areas that might need detail, I used engine black, such as on the screws here that were shiny silver before. After you've done that, the last step would be to take what they call a Bright Boy. Now a Bright Boy is nothing more than a rubber eraser that has a pumice material in it. This one happens to be one that's made for large-scale trains by LGB. You take that and you put it on top of the rails, and that polishes the top of the rails off to get rid of any paint or any of the scenery cement that might have been there from the night before. Once the track is finished and you're ready to start working on the actual scenery, there's several options that you have as to how the scenery could be done. One of the options is that the track and roadbed would be on its own piece of plywood so that you have areas that you can work above and below the track for your scenery. The other would be to do it flat on a board. Whichever way you do it, one of the things that's nice about working with modern scenery techniques is that you don't have to spend a lot of money. You can go to the lumber yard and buy a piece of insulation foam like the one I have here, and this works very nice as a scenery base, and it'll help fill in the areas where there isn't any board. Or if you have a flat board, this could go right on top. The material is easy to work with. You can take a razor knife, and by scoring it, it'll break fairly easily, and then that can be shaped by using a file or a saw or sandpaper. You can shape the corners round or any way you want for your scenery. By sanding it with sandpaper, that'll smooth it out. This gives you the option also, when you're doing your scenery, of either using hydrocal plaster over the top of this, or you could actually do your scenery right on top of the foam itself if you want to conserve on weight and on cost. And we'll work with both techniques here to show you how it works. All right, now once we've come up with a basic shape, you can take carpenter's glue or Elmer's glue, and by putting a little bit of that glue around on the foam, it'll allow the piece that's up above it to sit in place, and it'll fasten it down so that it'll stay in place. You can use nails, or what I'm going to use here is just drywall screws to help hold it in place while we're working on it. And then we'll go to the next layer. Now we can shape this with a file. And anytime you want to along the way, of course, you can change this. There's no mistakes. You can't make a mistake. If you don't like what you did, you can do it over. Maybe a little bit of sandpaper to smooth down some of the areas that are just filed. Now at this point, I think we're about ready to put some hydrocal plaster over the top, or if you were going to use just the foam itself, we could apply the ground cover right over the top of the foam. You would want to color the foam, however, with a water-based paint of some type so that it didn't give the appearance of having a white surface underneath. You'd want it gray or maybe green or something like the ground might be. So we're going to go ahead and I'll demonstrate two different ways that you could cover it with hydrocal plaster.
Woodland Scenics makes two hydrocal products. One is a plaster cloth and the other is a lightweight hydrocal. We're going to use both of these products. The plaster cloth is the same material as a doctor might use for a plaster cast. We have masked the track to avoid getting any of this material on the track during this process. Working with a lightweight hydrocal or the hydrocal cloth is very similar, but I like to work with a cloth. It's much easier. The cloth allows you to lay out the area that you're going to cover before it's wet. That's a rough side and a smooth side to the cloth. You want to put the rough side up and then smooth it out once we add the water. The lightweight hydrocal, on the other hand, needs to be mixed in a bowl with water, and then we dip the paper towels into the mixture and apply it much in the same way as we added the plaster cloth. The cloth is a lot easier and a lot less messy. You lay the cloth out and then cut it to length. Now, it's not important that we cut the cloth exactly because we can always fold over the ends. When we are laying this out, we want to overlap the cloth about 50%. Now, it's important that you spray the styrofoam with water before you lay the cloth on it. If we were to just lay the cloth on the styrofoam, it would absorb water from the plaster cloth, and we want to try to avoid that. I prefer to put the cloth in place on the wet styrofoam and then spray it to get it wet. You could also dip the cloth in water and then lay it on the styrofoam, but the cloth tends to deform this way, and I prefer to put it in place first and then spray it with water. After the cloth is in place, you want to start smoothing it out with your hands. You can either smooth this with your hands or you can do it with a brush. I prefer to do it with my hands. Some people are sensitive to the hydrocal, so you may want to wear rubber gloves or use a brush to do this if you are. As you rub the cloth, it starts the chemical reaction that's going to cause the plaster to set up. You'll notice the cloth getting warm. That's the chemical reaction starting to take place, and don't be concerned because this is normal. Be sure you overlap the cloth 50% as you go. This will give you a double layer of plaster everywhere on the layout. By using the styrofoam underneath, you don't need quite as much support for the plaster, and the hydrocal really gives you a very strong base for other material to come on top of it. As you rub on the cloth, you may notice it's starting to get warm. That's nothing to be concerned about. That's the chemical reaction we were talking about. You want to continue smoothing this until it kind of fills in all of the holes in the paper and the cloth. Get it smoothed in the shape you want. Now, what we've done here is the basic foundation for all of our senior materials. We're going to do the same thing again, but this time we're going to use paper towels and lightweight hydrocal. Now, you want to add the lightweight hydrocal to the water. If you were to do it the other way around, you'll get lumps. So you want to add the hydrocal, and then we're going to let the hydrocal sit for a little bit until the water is absorbed into the plaster material. Now, the less you have to mix this, the more time you're going to have to work with it. So we want to just be patient until the water is absorbed into the plaster.
All right, you can see the water starting to soak into the plaster pretty well. I think it's good enough where we can go ahead and mix it. While we were waiting for the plaster to be absorbed by the water, I've torn some paper towels in half here, and we're going to use these instead of the plaster cloth. This time we're going to dip them into the hydrocal, coating both sides of the paper towel. We're going to lay those up on the layout much the same way as we did before, overlapping each layer about 50%. Now, this is a little bit more messy than before, but it works much the same way and has about the same strength. We're going to continue on much the same way we have here,
and then we're going to go on to the next step.
Now that we've finished with the hydrocal, we're going to move over to a larger layout so we can see how all these different elements come together. We mix the molding plaster much in the same way we mix the hydrocal. You add the water to the bowl first, and then you add the plaster to the water. The reason for that is because it keeps the plaster from creating lumps in the mixture when you mix it. Now when you add the plaster to the water, it takes a while for the water to be absorbed into the plaster. And so what we want to do is we want to just sit and wait a little bit for that to be absorbed. Now this would be mixed a little bit thicker than the mixture that we made for the hydrocal. I would say about the consistency of mayonnaise.
Once the plaster is mixed, we want to put a thin layer of plaster over all of the hydrocal. This will give us a surface that we can detail and add some texture to. It'll also give us the ability to do some carving and some shaping, possibly with a scalpel, or possibly even using a wire brush to add some detail. This is a lot of fun. Kind of like frosting a cake. Got to remember not to eat any of the frosting though. Now you can see that once the plaster has started to set up, it gives us the ability to carve, and here I'm carving some steps into the side of the hill. And a wire brush. Once the plaster is set up pretty good, you can use a wire brush to add some layers like you might see with stratified rock.
What we're going to do now is we're going to add some rock molds. Now the rock molds need to be soaking in water. And we soak them in what we call wet water. Wet water is nothing more than water with some liquid detergent in it that helps all of the cracks and crevices to be filled. Select the molds that you plan on using. Then you want to take a spray bottle of water, much the same way as we did before, and get the area that you're going to apply the molds wet. We want to keep this plaster wet the whole time that we do this. All right? The plaster should be about ready to put in the mold. We put the plaster into the mold, dab the plaster so that it fills every little crack and crevice.
Now this mold is going to look quite shiny for some time until the plaster starts to set up. And actually the key to applying this mold is by the surface color and texture. This is not ready, but after it has a chance to dry, the surface of the mold is going to become a little bit opaque or dull in texture. Also, you'll notice there'll be some small cracks in the surface. That's how we can tell when it's ready to apply to the layout. All right, let's bend it again and see how we're doing.
See, the surface is starting to get some very definite surface cracks in it. Now that mold is just about ready right now to put up onto the layout. So I'm going to take this and put it up here, the area that we want the mold, and what I'm going to do is kind of shape it and squeeze some plaster out around the edges, and then I'm going to hold that in place. I'm going to take another mold and do the same thing. There's some good cracks. Now I'm just going to hold these molds in place for a little bit. Have you ever noticed when you've been on the beach, if you stand in the sand when it's wet and your feet sink into the sand, that after a little while it's hard to pull your feet loose? Well, we're kind of doing the same thing. We're holding the mold until the material in the mold kind of settles into place and it doesn't want to move anymore. As we hold this mold in place, you'll notice that after a little while it starts to turn warm. That's a chemical reaction that's happening with the plaster. Once the chemical reaction takes place and the mold starts to get hot, what you need to do is wait until it cools off before you remove the mold from the surface. You want to pull the edges of the mold off very, very slowly and very, very carefully. And then where the two molds come together, you need to carve that surface so that the two molds look like they belong together. So we're going to kind of carve here the edges, and then the top, we want to trim the top of this off so that it appears that the ground level kind of comes right up to the edge of the rock mold. By doing that, they look like they belong there instead of just somebody that plastered a rock mold up in place. Now in real life, rocks have stress cracks. So before we're done with the rock mold, we want to put some stress cracks in, usually at an angle, several, maybe some horizontally. And then we'll kind of clean those out a little bit, maybe with a wire brush. Right now they don't look very good, but after we add some color to that, they'll look a lot better. It'll help to add a little bit of detail to it. One more rock mold to remove, and once again I want to come all the way around the edges. And again clean off the top to match the ground that's around it. Something else we can do to help this area where we have two rock molds, sometimes it still looks like there might be two molds. We can carve a little ledge that goes across both molds. And that helps to add some unity to it. It looks like it might be one rock formation. That's how simple it is. We're completed with the rock molds, and we've got some molding plaster on the hydrocal to smooth it out a little bit. And we're ready to start adding some ground cover and some color and some texture. Now before we add the ground cover, we want to color the plaster so that what's underneath doesn't show through. And there's a product that Woodland Scenics makes which is like a water-based paint. It really is the pigment of the paint without the encapsulating agent that holds the paint together. Because of that, it allows us to put it on, and then we can actually wash it off with water if we want to thin it down. Or we can thin it with water as we put it on. Now you could either put this in a bottle and spray it on, or you can put it on with a brush. I like to put it on with a brush because it allows you to kind of move it around where you want the paint. So we'll start out by getting everything wet. One of the things about working with the Woodland Scenics products is you can keep the entire area wet as you work on it, and if you walk away from it you can come back in the morning and get it wet again. We've added a little bit of liquid detergent to the water so that it's wet water. Once again, wet water allows the water to flow into every little crack and crevice. What's happening is the liquid detergent kind of breaks the surface tension of the water to allow that to happen. So we're going to get the entire layout wet before we start applying the paint to it. And that'll take just a minute here. All right, we're putting some green undercoat in areas where there may be foliage or grass growing, and the other areas we'll cover with a brown or an earth undercoat. Now, as I mentioned, when you do this, if you don't want it full strength, you can actually come and wash some of it off with the water as you go. Or you can just thin it out and paint. I'm going to start using a little bit of brown undercoat here in areas where there might be rock or other formations. Thinning it as we go. And of course, it's not necessary to use this full strength if you don't want to. Now we need to use some other colors too as well, and I would suggest that you stick with some of the lighter colors. There's a yellow ochre. That'll help tone down some of the browns that we've done. Most of this is going to get covered up with grass on top, so you really won't see this color. What this really does is just kind of hides the white of the plaster. Alright, now there's some areas where we have stone that we really want to have a little bit more of a stone color. So in those areas we'll use some grays, and maybe even you could use some light blue that would mix in to show the shadows. Or in areas where it was really dark, you could use black. And then for areas that you had more of a desert southwest theme, you could use a little bit of raw umber, which is kind of a red. Just enough to kind of tint it. Now these vertical surfaces will show up after the ground cover is on, and the horizontal surfaces will have more of the scenery material on it. I'm going to go ahead and finish covering this over. We'll come back again in a minute when I get more of it covered. Okay, now that we have more of this covered up with color, there's a technique that's called a wash, which is nothing more than the paint mixed in with a lot of water, so you have a very thin wash. And the areas that we did earlier where we put the stress cracks in the rock, when we take a wash and we put down across the surface here, what happens is that that wash goes in every little crack and crevice and shows up all the relief in the rock. Now at first it may not look very good, but we're going to cover most of this up, remember, with ground cover so you won't see it. But the areas where the rock itself is will show all those little details, all the little relief, all the cracks. One more time across here.
Woodland Scenics makes several materials for ground cover. The finest material is called turf. There's several colors, but we're going to use 4. There's yellow grass, burnt grass, medium green, and blended turf. We glue that material down with a product we call Scenic Cement or matte formula. You want to spray the layout very thoroughly and wet it down pretty good. Now this material looks quite milky in its present state, but once it dries, it'll dry very transparent and opaque. It'll look very natural. We start by using the lighter colors, in this case the yellow grass, on top of the scenery cement, and we want to put this all over the layout. On the horizontal surfaces it builds up, but on the vertical surfaces you notice it just kind of leaves the rock formation showing through. And that's the way it is kind of in nature. Now this doesn't have to be perfectly even. In real life, grass isn't even. And now we'll switch to a darker color. Now this is more of a burnt grass. Has a little bit more green in it. Now in real life you're going to find green grass where there's water, and up at the higher elevations and out in open fields you'll have more yellow. So we want to leave some of the yellow showing through here. Maybe along the tracks and in the lower areas we'll get more of the green. I'm going to go ahead and put on the other colors and then give it a good soaking with scenery cement, but we're going to go on to the next step.
Now that we have the layout covered with the fine turf, it's time to add some weeds and some coarser turf. And the coarse turf is the same material, just ground a little bit more coarse. And the way we do that is we start out with some Elmer's glue or carpenter's glue, and we put the glue in the area that we want the coarse turf to be, generally. And then once again we start with the light colored material and we dab that into the glue. Then we come back to the medium color, which is kind of a light green, burnt grass color, and we add some of that. And then we go to the dark green. And up on top like this, where there may not be any water, we don't want a lot of the dark green, but just enough to add a little bit of variation to the color. Now once again, that looks pretty artificial, but if we spray it with some scenery cement, and then we add some more blended turf on top of it again to tie it together, it just looks like an area of weeds. Looks pretty good. I'm going to come around on that side and we'll do some over here. Once again, starting with a lighter color. And the burnt grass. And the medium green. Now there would be a little bit more of the medium green down here at the bottom along the tracks because of the availability of water. I'll do a little bit on the other side of the track over here. And once again, the dark green. A little bit of scenery cement. And the blended turf. Now there's two types of blended turf. One is a little bit more green and the other one is a little bit more brown. I tend to use the brown because unless you're working in an area where it's very tropical, you're not going to see very much green grass. Now I'm going to go ahead and finish the rest of this and then we'll come back again in a little bit. Now that we're finished putting the turf and the coarse turf on to make it look like weeds, we're ready to start putting maybe the gravel down for driveways and for roads. So what we need to do first is spray the area that we're planning on putting the gravel with our scenery cement and get it pretty well soaked. The scenery cement needs to be pretty thick here because the gravel tends to soak a lot of it up. So we're going to have to use several layers as we go along. Now we're just going to sprinkle that along on the areas where the road is going to be. Probably out in this area here we'll have a station, so we're going to have quite a large area of gravel in that area. And now I need to come back and put another layer of scenery cement on that before we put any more on. Now this scenery cement does look milky, but when it dries totally transparent, as you noticed with the track when we did it earlier. Anywhere you have a cliff or a rock face, there's a chance that during the winter when the ice freezes between the cracks, that you're going to get rock debris, and that rock debris is called talus. We're going to start out by using a rather coarse talus on the ledges and along the edge of the track. And anywhere where there's a cliff face, we're just going to put some talus right along the edge. And we're going to come back and get the coarse. Start out with the biggest rocks and you work toward the smallest. We get the medium. And we'll finish it off with the fine. Now, after you put the talus on, you want to get a good coat of scenery cement. And then before we're finished, if you think about it in real life, any place where you see rock like that, unless it had just fallen within a few days earlier, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to put some green material on it so it looks like moss or algae growing. So we'll start out maybe with the burnt grass. It's green, but yet not too dark. Just gives it the impression of having a little bit of moss or algae growing on it.
As before, blend the talus with blended turf and spray with scenery cement.
Field grass is something you find along the railroads all over the country. It just grows wild. Sometimes you find a whole field of it, but usually you just find small clumps of it in areas that are less traveled. What we want to do is we want to take some of the field grass out of the package, and then we want to pull it out so that the ends of it are different lengths. They're not flat, in other words. Then grab a hold of the bunch and then cut the end of it off so that it's square. Now I've drilled some holes in the table here, and what I'm going to do is put some glue in one of the holes. And then I'm going to take a screwdriver and I'm going to kind of push down on the square ends that I've cut off into that hole. Now you may have to take a pair of scissors and trim some of the higher pieces that you don't want standing up there, but when that glue dries on that, you'll be able to work with it a little bit also. There's another material that we use to show weeds and foliage and underbrush called polyfiber. Polyfiber is a very fine net-like material, and what we want to do is pull it out so it's very, very thin, almost to where you can't see it. This gives the impression of a very fine mat or netting that is over the ground, and what we're going to do is put a little bit of carpenter's glue or Elmer's glue down in a circle kind of in the area that we want this to be. And we'll put a little bit of scenery cement over the same area. Maybe pat down some of the glue so it's not quite so noticeable. And then we're going to take this polyfiber and kind of pull it around that area. Stretch it very, very thin over that entire area. Once we've done that, if we put scenery cement on it, it tends to stick up a little bit to show you where it's at. But one of the nice things about it is we can use that netting to do something else, like maybe put some wildflowers. Now these wildflowers come in packages of 4 different colors, and if we just kind of sprinkle that around the polyfiber, it gives the impression of wildflowers.
We also added red and white and sprayed the area with scenery cement.
This material is polyfiber that has the senior material, coarse turf, embedded in it. So we can unwrap it, we tear a piece off, and then we can stretch it out as well, maybe in 2 or 3 pieces. Now if we take some glue And we put some glue down in some of the areas that it would be possible to have this type of thing. We can stretch this out much the same way we did the polyfiber. And have it look like weeds that are growing up the side of the hill. And we want to use 2 or 3 colors. We don't want to use all one color. So we'll start with the darkest and we'll work toward the lightest with this material. I'll go ahead and finish this as before. I'll blend the foliage with blended turf and I'll spray the area with scenery cement. Now that the scenery material is mostly finished and the ground cover is on, we want to go back to our rock faces and do some dry brushing. Dry brushing is a technique that we use with a paintbrush with a very small amount of paint on it that we drag across the surface to put highlights in the rock faces. Now there's really a couple schools of thought here. You can do your rocks in a very light wash and then use a dark wash to fill in the cracks, or you could use the paint full strength, opaque, and then come back and put highlights in it like we did here. It depends on the type of scenery you're doing, but personally I like this type of an effect for areas where it may be long weathered by the elements. I think it looks a lot more natural. Well, the layout's come a long ways in the last few minutes. I think we're about ready to start adding some finishing details. This layout's going to be used at the International Gift Mart in Atlanta to introduce our Village Express, which is a train that we had made exclusively to go with the Christmas villages. I borrowed these village pieces from one of our local Christmas stores, and we'll use those just to kind of demonstrate how you can detail around the buildings. You'll notice that the bases of the buildings have some open areas, and we'll be filling some of those open areas in with some scenery material, and we'll also be planting some trees. Now that we've masked the wires for the lights in the buildings and some of the bases of the buildings, I think we're ready to make some trees. Now there's several options for making trees. Woodland Scenics has a large variety and size of trees, and there's other companies as well. We're going to use 2 types of trees on this layout. The first type is going to be a ready-made tree from a company that's called Accurate Dimensionals, and they're made out of a material that looks very realistic, and they come in several different colors, both fall colors and also green. We're going to use several of these trees. Woodland Scenics makes trees that have a plastic armature. They come in a bag with anywhere from 7 to 40 trees, and it's made out of a plastic which has a memory. You can bend the plastic, and the plastic stays bent in the shape that you bend it. And you can buy these trees also ready-made if you want, but it's really a lot of fun to make them. You can take the base, which is provided, and twist it off, and now you take the branches and you start twisting the branches so that they look more natural, and they'll stay in whatever position you twist them. The next thing is the foliage. The foliage comes in 3 different colors, and you could put them on one color at a time. If you do that, it's a good idea to start with the darkest color and work toward the lightest, so the shadows would be inside the tree and the highlights would be outside. To make it simple and quick, I've added all 3 colors into one bowl, and we're going to add some glue in the form of a Hobby-Tack cement to the armature, and then we'll roll that in the foliage. Now, it's not really necessary to be exacting about this. If you don't like it, you can tear the foliage off and start over. And we probably will pull some of the foliage off after we roll it in the material. Okay, we roll that in the foliage, and we have an instant tree. You can drill a hole where you want the tree and set the tree in position. I'm going to go ahead and finish off the layout with more trees, and we'll come back in a few minutes and we'll see what it looks like.
Here is our finished layout. It was a lot of fun to do, and as you now know, it's very easy to create a beautiful diorama. All of the products used here are available from H&R Trains or your favorite hobby shop. Happy modeling!